Dawn Davis. She's going to talk about peyote habitat loss and examination of threats using GIS. So Dawn is a very special person that as a Native American peyote user or peyotist has started to notice in her own story that the buttons are getting smaller and smaller and disappearing, and that made her sad, a little bit against the odds and wills and what she was expected to do. She decided to invent a research kind of autonomously and independently out of her own mind, not exactly, necessarily backed up by everybody, and went all the way and fought for grants and fought for getting into a master program, did the master, complete the master, and is now a Ph.D. student. She's a Ph.D. student at the University of Idaho, and she's also a mother and a wife, a micro farmer, a small business owner, and she's a member of the Shoshone-Bannock tribe. She lives in Fort Hall Indian Reservation in Idaho. Thank you, and please welcome Dawn.
Thank you. I do want to give a special thanks to Bia. She's been an advocate for my research for several years now, so thank you, Bia. I shared with Bia one time, I don't know if she remembers, but in the Shoshone language, Bia actually means mother. I don't know if she wants to be called that, but. So anyhow, thank you all for being here for us to talk about horizons. My presentation is Peyote habitat loss and examination of threats using GIS, which stands for Geographic Information Systems. And before I begin any presentation that I do, I like to provide some space to acknowledge my family, because as Bia mentioned, before anything, I am a mother and I am a wife. So it's important that I acknowledge them, and especially my husband, Cleve. He's been a real big supporter and has helped me with some of our data on this presentation, as well as his GIS expertise. Being a peyote researcher as an indigenous person is difficult, and so it's good, and I'm thankful to have him walking beside me on this journey. We also have our daughters, Liliana and Isla. Some of you may have seen Isla here yesterday. But I also like to acknowledge my maternal grandparents, my late grandfather Levon Jackson and my grandmother Lillian, because together the two of them taught me about peyote. I am a natural resources student. I'm funded under the Pacific Northwest Cosmos AGAP program. I'm also an ISTEM scholar and National Science Foundation IGERT associate. And so though I am all of those things, a student, a tribal person, a peotist, I don't speak on behalf of any of those entities. I only speak on behalf of myself. So I'd like to make that very clear. So my work in peyote perpetuation, as Bia had mentioned, is work that's been continued from my master's work. But it started much earlier than that, because I've had a relationship with peyote my entire life. Though I recognize peyote's medicinal qualities, I also recognize its endangerment. And that's why I've made peyote my life's work. And so growing up on the reservation, my family held peyote meetings at our home, and we attended ceremonies outside of our home. I attended them with my grandmother, who I call Granny. She hates it, but that's her name. And we would attend peyote meetings. That's what I've called them for my entire life, as peyote meetings. And it wasn't until I was much older that I realized that this was actually associated with the Native American church. And so as a young girl, I witnessed my grandparents dry and prepare medicine for our own family use. And, they were very large. And I knew that this medicine had traveled a long way to get to our home. And they were quite large back then, but I noticed over time in ceremony that these peyote buttons were becoming significantly smaller. So I asked my granny why that was, and I remember her telling me that that's all they could get. And I don't really remember if I knew what that meant at the time. But over time, continually, these small buttons were a common sight. And so ultimately, all those questions that I had been asking my granny about peyote resulted in my master's thesis. And so while conducting my research, I had the privilege of meeting Ted Herrera. He's a Coyotecan from Texas, and he had once said that before our ways of life came to an end, our natural resources were sacred. Our ancestors prayed for the survival of their descendants, that they would keep their ways and protect their natural resources. We are those descendants. And so because I've had this relationship with peyote and this peyote medicine, this statement strikes me intimately. It reminds me of my responsibility for the perpetuation of this medicine. My cultural teachings have also taught me that as humans and non-humans alike, we have an equal right to exist, and that we are part of nature and not separate from it. Peyote is a plant worthy of protecting, not just for myself, for my children, for my grandchildren, but for peyote itself. And because I was raised by my maternal grandparents in our traditional home, I knew that studying peyote in a university setting would be a sensitive and controversial subject. So I talked with them, and I expressed not only my research ideas, but my concerns about how this inquiry would be perceived by other peyotists. You know, I'm still considered young. I'm a woman. There was already obstacles in front of me to continue with this research, but my grandparents were very supporting, and so I've continued with that. And so I'm always asking with my research, what is the indigenous approach to resolving habitat and peyote, or habitat and population perpetuation of peyote, and how can we use GIS to depict spatially this urgency? And so if you look at this historical timeline, I'm not expecting you to read it, you'll notice that the Native American Church was established in 1918, and actions that followed included acts of prohibition, possession, and straight outlawing of peyote. Because of peyote's long bureaucratic history, perpetuation efforts need to be addressed as a bottom-up approach from peyotists directly. It's also important that we acknowledge the fact that the peyote religion is protected by the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, which protects the use of peyote by members of a federally recognized tribe, but it fails to provide protection for the peyote plant. And so what is peyote, and what exactly does it look like? First of all, peyote is a beautiful plant. It comes from the Nahuatl word Peyote, which refers to the white tufts on peyote. Peyote is also the word used for a caterpillar cocoon. So peyote is a slow-growing cactus. It takes about 5 years to reach maturity. It's considered a medicine by Native American Church members, peyotists, and countless others. Peyote has many different pronunciations, as well as tribal and indigenous names, but the translation ultimately means medicine. It's an entheogen grounded on a spiritual foundation. When used in ceremony, peyote is only one element of the ritual. Ceremonial practices include aspects of Native American epistemologies, cosmologies, and has become a melting pot containing various Native American ceremonial elements and rituals. But peyote is a very sensitive plant. It grows under the shade of the creosote. Together they have a commensalistic relationship, meaning that the peyote benefits from the creosote, but the creosote does not. It prefers calcium-rich gravelly loam, or decomposing limestone soils containing abundant rock, and can tolerate temperatures from 35 to 104 degrees, which makes the southern region of Texas an optimal habitat. This is the only region within the United States where peyote grows. Peyote is not only a revered medicinal plant, it's a beautiful plant. It's worthy of protecting for its right to grow wildly within its habitat. And where is that habitat? The habitat lies along the Texas-Mexico border in an area referred to as the Peyote Gardens, which is a sacred space. Vine Deloria had once wrote in God is Red that Indians who have never visited certain sacred sites nevertheless know of these places from the community knowledge, and they intuit this knowing to be an essential part of their being. And so though many Native American members and peyotists have never visited this area, they acknowledge the Peyote Gardens as a revered space. And it should be encouraged for peyotists to physically experience the Peyote Gardens, to cultivate their own spiritual connection to the land, and instill the responsibility and obligation to the habitat which is required for peyote perpetuation. Growing up, I had heard my maternal grandfather, I call him Dogo, talk about his visit to the gardens and how he had gone out to collect peyote himself. And he had said that it took him hours to find his first button. And he said it felt like they were hiding. But he said as he saw his first one, he said it was like they just showed themselves to him. And I knew that this was a place I would ultimately experience, I just didn't know when. I was honestly afraid of this space because of the power it had manifested in my mind from my ceremonial experiences. And so in 2011, my daughter and I, my oldest daughter and I, we made our trip to the gardens where we met our first peyote distributor, Mr. Salvador Johnson. And the background image of this slide shows where that visit was. This is a photo of the gardens. So Salvador is one of 3 licensed peyote distributors. They're licensed through the Texas Department of Public Safety in addition to acquiring licenses from the DEA. And so Salvador took myself out to a patch of land that he called the ranch in Stark County. And this was a piece of land that he had leased from a landowner. And when we were driving, we had, discussions about his role as a peyotero, his struggles as a peyotero, his experiences as a harvester, a lot of those things. And eventually, we made it to a patch of land where we were walking. And Salvador had walked, a ways in front of me, and I was searching on the ground for peyote for quite a while, and I was determined to find my own peyote. But everything out there just looked like clusters of peyote absolutely everywhere. And so Salvador actually pointed out the first peyote button to me. It was a cluster of peyote buttons. And when I looked at it, I was literally shocked because I just fell to my knees and was looking at this plant. I wanted to touch it, I wanted to feel it, I wanted to get a picture as well. But I needed to be able to see that, to have that experience. And so at that moment, it was actually a spiritually and heart-moving moment for me because I had made that connection to the plant growing in its habitat and made the connection to the medicine that I have at home in a glass jar. And so this medicine that I had seen all these years came from that space growing wildly. And as we walked back to the truck, there they were. All these peyotes were just everywhere. We walked back almost the same way that we had walked in, and there they were. They showed themselves to me, just like they had for my dogo almost 30 years ago. And so on our drive back, I asked Salvador how many Native American church members he had taken into the gardens in his 30-plus years as a peyotero, and he said 1. So I asked him, well, who was that? And he said, you. And in all his years, I was shocked. I couldn't believe that in all these years, no one had asked to go out into the gardens. And so for me, that confirmed my theory about the disconnection between peyotes and the peyote habitat. And so I truly understood at that moment the pivotal role that peyoteros and landowners served to the Native American church members and peyotes across the nation. With only 3 licensed distributors, the relationship with peyoteros has remained key since about 1870, if not before, in maintaining access to the peyote with the Texas landowners. So this relationship has been cultivated by Native American church members. However, maintaining permits with the Texas Department of Public Safety is becoming increasingly difficult, and even more so for individuals trying to break into the peyote business. There's a parallel trend in revenue earned and buttons sold. So from 1988 through 2016, there's a decline clearly in the number of buttons. Does this mean that wild populations are also declining? To answer the question, we would need further population level field data to answer that. So from 1998 through 2013, an increase in revenue is occurring. There's clearly an increase in that trend. And this is a typical supply-demand curve. In other words, it appears that a decrease in supply is maybe resulting in an increase in demand. So from 2013 through 2016, both the revenue and the number of buttons sold are in decline. This could be related to many things: less demand for peyote or an increase in the cost of fuel. What this graph does not address is the size of peyote buttons. It is safe to say that in 1974, peyote buttons were significantly larger than they are today. Yet, in 2016, the number of buttons sold was less than that of 1974. So does this mean that there was less of a demand, or are there fewer peyotists purchasing peyote? Was there not enough peyote available due to land leases, or was there a lack of harvest employees? It's difficult to say and to interpret what this trend is saying without further research. If there's anyone who has ideas or theories about this graph, I'd appreciate your input. So what are the major threats that are occurring within the gardens to the habitat and the population? What we do know about habitat threats include root plowing, oil development, disturbance from feral hogs, exurban development, and development from wind farms. Over 1 million feral hogs live in Texas. Though they're not eating peyote, they are trampling large tracts of habitat. There's an increase in wind farm development, which leads to infrastructure and further destruction of the peyote gardens. And so, in regard to population threats, those include harvesting techniques by peyote distributors, the high demand for both legal and illegal peyote, and an increase in narcotourism, particularly in the southern habitat. This likely will lead to further habitat and population destruction, not to mention problems for the peyotes and other indigenous people, including the Huichol. One self-regulating method is related to the way in which peyote is harvested, and the harvesting techniques are debatable as well. But what has been recommended and what has been traditionally practiced is that peyote is harvested at the base of the peyote cactus. So peyote grows in a root. This is a previously harvested peyote that's been harvested at least 5 times, and it's in very poor health. Most likely this plant died. And this is the proper way to harvest it, right at the ground level, so that it can regenerate. And this is a regenerated peyote that created 2 pups out of 1 peyote. So this is still 1 plant. And so what those threats can lead to is actually it's a very scary situation, because this could lead to extinction. And that's very similar to what happened with Astrophytum asteris. So in the 70s, when peyote curiosity was at its peak, individuals were out in the Texas desert harvesting what they thought was peyote, but they were actually harvesting this beautiful plant. This is the star cactus. And because of that collection, Astrophytum was placed on the endangered species list in 1993, and it's still today on the endangered species list. And it grows within a very close vicinity of peyote. So, is the peyote depletion a known issue with peyotes? According to interviews conducted in 2009 to 2011, various tribal members were interviewed. Some of them had affiliation with the Native American Church, and some were peyoteros. And so out of the research, 70% of the interviewees had no knowledge of any peyote depletion that was occurring within the habitat. So this information is reflective of that disconnection between peyotes and the peyote habitat. Educating and informing peyotes on the current state of the peyote status is not only critical for sustainability, but it's imperative that that nexus be developed with landowners and implementing traditional ecological knowledge. This includes development of high-resolution maps that will visually depict the current range and habitat loss of available peyote. So to reiterate that complexity of the peyote policy, there are various stakeholders involved. the Native American Church, Peyotes, Texas landowners, Peyoteros, the Texas Department of Public Safety, Huichols, the Cactus Conservation Institute, and other non-governmental organizations. Additionally, some of the previous policy recommendations included amending the regulation policy for licensed peyoteros to include button size class of the peyote to be to be larger than 2.5 inches in diameter, or at least 5 years old, because that has ensured that it's seeded and that it's a mature plant, and to also include a 5-year rotation plan on their harvesting plots. Implementing quantity quotas on sales transactions, and also having indigenous voices when developing policy. So why is all of this important? Peyote is considered endangered at the local level, and there are no protections in place for its perpetuation. Where only 10 to 20% of the habitat resides within the United States border, almost 90 to 100% of that habitat is located on private property, making Texas landowners a key stakeholder for access and protection. Little is known about the perspectives carried by Texas landowners on their position about peyote. A nexus between them and peyote needs to be understood so that a plan can be developed for future peyote perpetuation. What my current research is addressing is how programs like the Geographic Information System, like Esri's ArcMap ArcPro software, can be used to visually depict the current habitat status. The displayed image is a draft that reflects the delineation of 2 known maps of the peyote habitat. Though there are several maps that exist that define similar boundaries, no specified range has been decided upon. Ultimately, this map will delineate and overlay several published peyote ranges into one to determine the core habitat. And this is a Google image from Starr County. And this is just a glimpse of the habitat that shows the geography of the land and current infrastructure. And this is just to show you how complex the peyote gardens really are. So in conclusion, as I continue my research and examine the habitat using GIS, I also want to continue to engage with peyotists and landowners across its range. Their perspectives are vital in the perpetuation of this medicinal sacrament. As a lifelong peyotist, this work comes intrinsically from my heart, yet it is challenging work as an Indigenous person. And so with that, I appreciate the opportunity to be a voice for peyote as an Indigenous person, because I strongly believe that key to peyote perpetuation is to have Indigenous voices speaking on Indigenous topics. So thank you.
I was just wondering if peyote can only be foraged, or if it's possible to cultivate it under the right circumstances.
Under the right circumstances?
Yeah.
Yes, and there are researchers out there who have actually done extensive research on peyote cultivation and encouraging Native American church members to cultivate their own medicine in greenhouses. And there's an entire step-by-step process that's been done to encourage that, which would give peyote habitat some period of rest if that were to be implemented and practiced.
Yeah, I want to point out to the Cactus Conservation Institute and the work of Dr. Martin Terry. It's the main NGO in the US that is doing this kind of research.
Correct.
Hi, I'm Margaret Abiono.
Hi.
And I just want to tell you, not that you don't know already, that you stand unique in this conference. And you stand unique because you grew up with peyote. Mm-hmm. It was normal for you. You did not have to hide it. You didn't even know there was anything to hide in it. And I'd just like to know what
I did have to hide it, actually.
Okay.
That was something that I didn't share with my 5th grade class, So yes, it was hidden.
Okay, but can you tell me the experience of growing up with that? What, it's an entheogen, so how was that, growing up with that, having it all your life, and what it meant to you? You know, what was your experience now that you see the rest of the world and see we don't have that access? What was it like for you?
Growing up, having access was never an issue. That wasn't ever something I worried about. That was something my grandparents worried about. And so for me, it was just very normal. It wasn't, I mean, like I said, it wasn't something that I shared with, you know, my high school friends that I was in ceremony having peyote, because they wouldn't understand. There's a lot of misunderstandings about peyote, as there continues to be. There still continues to be misunderstandings about peyote, which is why peyote is still a Schedule I substance. And so growing up with this in my home was just very, very normal. And so when I was able to actually go to the peyote habitat, it was very, very eye-opening for me because I made that connection. I realized that yes, it really did have a long journey to get to me in my ceremonial space living in Idaho, to have that medicine in front of me, knowing that it was growing in the far reaches of Texas and Mexico. So, you know, it was very sacred to me, and it continues to be very sacred to me, which is why I'm up here today talking about preservation and perpetuation of peyote.
I'm from the Wampanoag tribe out here in the east, and I was just wondering what the tribes out there thought about the connection to peyote, to Eastern tribes, even though we had no exposure to it. Like, does that connection still exist? What do you think about that?
The peyote religion, in the context of the Native American church, is a melting pot. It includes religious elements from various tribes. I mean, they'll have an altar that could belong to the Navajo, and they could have rattles that belong to the Comanche. I mean, the religion that we practice on my reservation came from either the Comanche, or it came from, most likely it came from the Comanche, but we got that from various other tribes as well. So it's just this mixed religion that even participating in ceremonies in different, outside of Idaho, I recognized outside influence. And I think that with the religion, it's never going to be static. It's always going to be evolving. And they now have chapters that exist in Canada. They now have chapters that exist here in New York. So the religion is definitely spreading, which is going back to that urgency of perpetuation, because with the spread of the religion, that increases the number of users.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your talk. I have a general question about the resources available for and the practicality of physical installations such as barriers and enclosures for protection of areas in which peyote is growing. I'd imagine resources would probably be pretty limited, and then even if they were available, what would be the practicality of attempting to physically protect areas in which peyote could be trampled by wild boar populations or be protected from illegal foraging and that kind of thing?
Well, right now what they have in place physically are physical barriers, fences, that kind of thing. But as far as other protections, you could look at conservation easements or tax incentives for landowners to protect that space. And that's a part of what my dissertation is looking at, is landowner, private property conservation.
Yeah, just want to add in that, you know, one of the threats of peyote is certainly the harvesters and the illegal harvesting, but the other big threat is just our model of development and root plotting and development of land and oil exploitation, and in Mexico, mining exploitation. So what's really at stake together with ayahuasca is just not our bad harvesting practices, but it's the large-scale annihilation of the traditional environments of these plants.
this segues into my question about risks towards the plant with climate change, and if that could be added as a climate risk mapping to the GIS work that you've done.
I believe that it is. I definitely believe that it is. But the work that I'm doing right now with GIS is complicated enough, much less trying to add a layer of climate change data to that. So I know that it exists, and I know that climate change is definitely affecting that habitat, because that could also not just affect the plant, it's affecting the water, it's affecting the other animals, it's affecting the other vegetation within that area. But my research isn't directly looking at climate change.
Hi. Can you talk a little bit about your relationship with the plant as a young person? Maybe what you learned or what you remember or how its influence on you?
Again, I think that influence is reflective of me being up here today talking about the perpetuation of peyote. I don't really talk about my ceremonial experiences because that's private to me, so that's not something that I really share. But because of those private moments, that's what makes this research that's why this research comes from my heart, is because I want to make sure that this medicine is protected for use by Native American members and for protection of the peyote plant itself.
Hello. Hi, my name is Alexander Hilsheimer. I'm an engineering student.
Hi.
I'm not sure if ArcGIS maps are updated on a yearly basis. I was wondering what tools you were using or considering using. I know with the right permissions, drones and weather balloons are tools that can be used to create maps. So which tools were you proposing using or planning on using? Thanks.
So I was taught with ArcGIS. And now ArcGIS is phasing out into ArcPro. So now I'm having to learn ArcPro, which is very, very, they say it's easier, more user-friendly, but I don't know, we'll see about that. But some of the tools I'm using are really looking at, delineating these known maps. And so it's taking the picture map and putting it into a polygon and creating this entire physical space. So as far as tools, that's what I'm looking at.
Hi, my name is Jenny. Thank you so much for being here today and speaking about this. It's really awesome to have you here.
Thanks.
My question was on the use of mescaline and the synthesis of mescaline outside of ceremonial settings and use by Westerners. I was wondering if you could speak to your thoughts or your feelings on the synthesis and the increase in interest from other individuals, if you feel as though this is appropriation. And yeah, I just wanted to hear your thoughts as an indigenous practitioner.
That's the question that I hate the most. I really do hate that question. Because, as an indigenous researcher, as Bia had mentioned, it was a battle for me to do this research in the university setting. And I don't want to push away those non-indigenous allies because we need those allies. The peyote really, really needs those non-indigenous allies. But my own personal opinion is that because peyote was so hard fought for Native Americans to have access to and to be able to have the ability to practice a religion, I don't really feel that it's so appropriate to be appropriated. And that is what's happening with peyote. And peyote is considered an endangered plant. And so it's important that those non-indigenous peyotists be mindful of where they're getting their peyote, how that peyote is coming to them in their ceremonial spaces, and to recognize that that plant is endangered. And if there is, synthetic mescaline that is out there, all the non-indigenous people can have free access to that, but let's leave the plant for the indigenous people.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you answering that question.
Hey, Dawn, I want to ask you a question, and
No, you cannot answer me.
I want you to be very honest with your answer, if you can. So we have lobbied to bring more indigenous voices to psychedelic science 2017, and it depends on how you want to see the glass is half full or half empty. On the one side it was great, but on the other it's such a tiny presence still. And I know that you participated in the track, on the plant medicine track, and that was in April 2017, and we are in October 2018. So 1.5 years, I believe you have been, since you appeared in that conference, invited maybe to 8 conferences or something along these lines. I just want to ask you, how are you feeling to be sucked into this psychedelic science circuit and going from conference to conference? What is the feeling, and how is it on your end from being Idaho, quietly doing your research, and now kind of going to the world? And for us that are organizing, what can we do better, or how can we keep on supporting this? Or even, is this a legitimate question that we bring in indigenous voices, or is this more for us to feel better? How is it on your side?
So when I got invited to do psychedelic science, I was just starting my Ph.D. and I was starting as an environmental science student with the intention of trying to continue with peyote research. But I was having a hard time finding a professor who was willing to take me on to do peyote research. No one wanted to touch me. Everyone was hands off. And thankfully, the chair at the time said, "I'll accept you. You can continue to do your classwork till you find a professor." So that was great. And so when I got your invitation to do psychedelic science, I think you had actually emailed me twice. And the second time I got the email and I was thinking, what is this? Psychedelic science, what? And so we started our dialogue, and I never, ever associated my peyote research with psychedelic science. Because to me, it was always a medicine. It was always about religion. And it was always about my sacred space. And then to have psychedelics thrown into that, I was like, wow, this is probably the space I need to be in, right? And so I'm really enjoying being in this space because I am finding those allies. And it is difficult to be up here, to stand in front of a room full of mostly non-Indigenous people and tell you that peyote is for Native Americans. It's hard to say that because I'm sure that will turn away a lot of people. That pushes a lot of people away. But to be in this space of psychedelic science, it is important to have these Indigenous voices, because the Indigenous voice, next to the woman and next to, other people of color, we're the very bottom. Indigenous people are always getting stepped on. And when it comes back to the Native American church, we're the only church probably in the world that requires that you have a card that says you belong to a religion. Unless I'm wrong, is there somebody else out here that has a card that says they belong to a specific church? I didn't think so. So yes, it's important to have Indigenous voices talking about Indigenous topics, because we're never at the table. Indigenous people are always at the back of the table or at the back of the room. They're never at the table. So I feel that this is a good platform to be able to express and be a voice, because I know that there are other people, there are other Indigenous people out there working on issues like peyote. So I'm happy to be a part of that. And I believe that venues like this, outlets like this, are the best place to be when it comes to this type of work.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you.